Commissioner had seen death in all its forms across the galaxy. For 300 years, he had traveled from world to world, documenting how different species said goodbye to their dead. He had witnessed the flash burnings of the where bodies turned to light in seconds. He had observed the silent drifts of the where the dead floated into space without ceremony or sound. He had studied the crystal preservations of his own people, the where bodies were turned to glass and stored in vast libraries. Death was universal. Every species in the galactic accord faced it, but how they handled it varied greatly, and that was what made its work important. The Cosmic Mourning Commission existed to record these practices, to preserve them, to understand what they said about each civilization. When humans applied to join the Galactic Accord, the Commission added Earth to their schedule. It was standard procedure. Every new species had to be documented, expected nothing special. The initial reports on humans were unremarkable. They were young, both as individuals and as a spacefaring civilization. They lived less than a century on average. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. They were emotional creatures, prone to violence and sentiment in equal measure. The Commission's ship entered Earth's orbit on a gray morning in October. They had been granted permission to observe a funeral in a small town on an island humans called Ireland. The deceased was Oz, aged 87, a teacher, retired, survived by 3 children, 7 and 2 great. Nothing unusual by any standard could measure. The Commission materialized at the back of the funeral venue, their forms hidden by cloaking technology. They were there to observe, not to interfere. The building itself was strange. It was old, made of stone, with colored glass windows that depicted ancient religious imagery. Humans called it a church. The structure had stood for over 400 years, maintained and cared for despite humanity's technological advancement. This puzzled. Why preserve such primitive architecture? Inside, approximately 200 humans had gathered. They wore black clothing, a common mourning color among many species. They sat in long wooden benches, facing forward toward a raised platform. At the front of the room sat a box made of polished wood. O's body rested inside it, though the lid was closed. Activated his recording equipment. His team spread out slightly, each member focusing on different aspects of the ceremony. They had done this countless times before. Document the ritual, note the emotional responses, record the social patterns, file the report, move on to the next species. Then the ceremony began. A human male in ceremonial robe stepped to the front. He was old by human standards, perhaps 70. He welcomed everyone and spoke about life in brief terms. Standard procedure so far. Many species began their death rituals with biographical information. But then something unexpected happened. The humans began to sing. It was not like any death song had heard before. The choir sang in perfect mathematical harmonics, their voices creating patterns that honored the cosmic order. They used specific frequencies that supposedly helped the soul transition to the next realm. But these humans sang something different entirely. The song was called Be Thou My Vision, and it was ancient by human standards, over 1,000 years old. The melody was simple, but the voices carrying it were not. Some humans sang strongly, their voices clear and confident. Others sang with voices that broke and wavered. Could hear tears in their throats, sorrow in their breath, yet they continued singing. The words spoke of faith, of guidance, of love that transcended death. Sensory organs registered something his equipment confirmed, but his mind struggled to accept. The emotional resonance in the room was creating measurable energy patterns. Grief was not being hidden or controlled. It was being shared. Each human in that room was actively participating in something collective, something that distributed the weight of loss among all of them. After the song ended, a young human woman approached the wooden podium. She was perhaps 30 years old. Her eyes were red from crying. She carried a piece of paper in her trembling hands. "My name is Sarah," she began, her voice barely steady. "Was my grandmother." Then Sarah did something that made lean forward, his attention completely captured. She told stories. Not just biographical facts, not ritual phrases, stories. She told about how it taught her to bake bread when she was 7 years old, how the kitchen would fill with the smell of yeast and flour, how hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, would guide her small fingers in kneading the dough, how always said that bread was love made visible, something you could touch and taste and share. Sarah told about the time drove through a snowstorm to reach her when Sarah's first child was born, how sat beside the hospital bed, holding Sarah's hand, telling her she was strong enough, brave enough, that women had been doing this since the beginning of time, and Sarah was part of that ancient chain. She told about's love of terrible jokes, how she would laugh at her own punchlines before she finished telling them, how her laugh sounded like music, bright and clear even as her body grew frail. Sarah's voice cracked. She paused, took a breath, continued. She told about the last conversation they had, 3 days before died, how it said she was not afraid, how she had lived a good life, loved good people, and was ready to rest, how she had made Sarah promise to take care of her grandfather's watch and her mother's recipe box. By the time Sarah finished, there was not a dry eye in the room, including among the observers hidden at the back. Felt moisture leaking from 6 of his 9 sensory organs. This had never happened in 300 years of field work. More humans came forward. Sun spoke about her strength during hard times. A former student, now 50 years old, spoke about how it believed in her when no one else did, how that belief had changed the course of her life. A neighbor spoke about kindness, how she brought soup when people were sick, how she remembered everyone's birthdays. Each person added layers to the picture of who had been. Not just facts, but personality, humor, flaws, quirks, loves and fears and dreams. The humans were not just mourning the biological cessation of one of their species. They were reconstructing an entire consciousness through shared memory. They were refusing to let disappear. The priest spoke next. He read from their holy book, the Bible. He spoke of resurrection, of eternal life, of souls that transcended physical death. He claimed with complete conviction that was not truly gone, that she existed now in a better place, free from pain and sorrow. Logically, these were untestable claims. There was no empirical evidence for an afterlife. The Galactic Accord had studied the question extensively. When biological function ceased, consciousness ended. This was scientific fact, confirmed across hundreds of species. Yet every human in that room drew visible comfort from the priest's words. They believed, or wanted to believe, or found meaning in the act of believing itself. The contradiction did not seem to trouble them. After the church service, the humans transported its body to a burial ground. The commission followed, still cloaked. The cemetery was another puzzle. Humans buried their dead in the ground and marked the spots with carved stones. They maintained these places for centuries. They visited them. They brought flowers. They spoke to graves as if the dead could hear them. At the graveside, a young man stepped forward. He was grandson, perhaps 16 years old. His hands shook as he unfolded a piece of paper. He explained that he was going to read a poem, something had loved. The poem was called Funeral Blues, written by a human named W.H. who had been dead for decades. The boy's young voice carried across the gray morning air. "Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone," he began. "Prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos and with muffled drum bring out the coffin, let the mourners come." The words described grief so profound that it demanded the universe itself pause. The loss of one person, the poem suggested, should make the stars go dark, the moon disappear, the oceans empty. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was mathematically irrational. It was the most beautiful thing had ever heard. The poem continued, each line more devastating than the last. "I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong." The simple acknowledgement of human mortality, of the gap between hope and reality, struck with physical force. As wooden box was lowered into the earth, the humans threw flowers onto it. Some threw dirt. Each person said goodbye in their own way. Some spoke aloud. Some were silent. Some wept openly. Some stood stoic and still. But all of them stayed. No one left until the grave was completely filled, until the last flower was laid, until every person had their moment to acknowledge the reality of death. Afterward, the humans gathered in a building they called a community hall. They ate food together. They shared more stories about. They laughed at funny memories. They cried at sad ones. Children ran between the adults' legs. Bobbies were passed from arm to arm. Life continued even in the shadow of death. Watched it all, recording everything, his mind racing. This was not what he had expected. This was not normal. This was not like any death ritual he had documented in 3 centuries of work. When the commission returned to their ship that evening, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, junior researcher Kalzev, the youngest member of the team, broke the silence. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think we need to observe more human funerals before we file our report." Nodded slowly. For the first time in his long career, he felt that he had witnessed something he did not understand, something that required deeper study, something that might change everything the commission thought they knew about death and grief and meaning. "Agreed," he said. "Request permission from Earth's authorities. We will need to observe at least 200 more ceremonies across different cultures and regions." 200, sir?" Kalzev asked. Looked at the data streaming across his screens, the emotional resonance patterns, the quantum entanglement of shared grief, the impossible beauty of humans fighting against the meaninglessness of death with nothing but stories and songs and tears and love. "Yes," he said firmly, "perhaps more. We cannot make a proper assessment from a single observation. Human death rituals may be far more complex than we anticipated." He did not say what he was really thinking, that in 300 years of studying death across the galaxy, he had just witnessed something unprecedented, that humans might have discovered something the rest of the galaxy had missed, that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity understood something profound about loss that every other species had failed to grasp. The commission stayed on Earth for 3 more months. They observed funerals of every kind. In New Orleans, they watched a jazz funeral where musicians played joyful music through the streets, celebrating life rather than mourning death. The crowd danced. They second-lined. They turned grief into movement and sound and defiant joy. Watched elderly humans dance with abandon. Watched children wave handkerchiefs in the air. Watched an entire community refuse to let death be the final word. In Japan, they observed a Buddhist cremation ceremony. The family used special chopsticks to pick bones from the ashes, placing them carefully in an urn. It was intimate and quiet, filled with ritual significance that stretched back thousands of years. The precision of the movements, the reverence in each gesture, spoke of respect for the body that had carried a human soul through life. In Ghana, they witnessed a celebration of life so colorful and loud that it seemed impossible anyone had died. The deceased's coffin was carved into the shape of a fish because he had been a fisherman. People wore bright colors. They danced. They told jokes. They spoke of the deceased as if he had simply moved to another village, one they could not visit but that surely existed somewhere. In the Australian outback, they observed an Aboriginal smoking ceremony. The smoke, they were told, helped the spirit find its way home. The ritual was ancient, predating human civilization as the galaxy understood it. The connection to land, to ancestors, to a continuity that stretched back tens of thousands of years was palpable. In Israel, they watched a Jewish burial take place within 24 hours of death. The body, wrapped simply in cloth, returned to the earth without preservation or ceremony beyond prayers that had been spoken in the same way for. Mourners tore their clothing. They sat Shiva for 7 days, receiving visitors, telling stories, praying together. In Mexico, they observed a Lowe's celebration where families built elaborate altars to deceased loved ones, decorating them with flowers and food and photographs. The dead were not gone, the humans believed. They returned once a year to visit. Death was not an ending but a transition, and the connection between the living and the dead remained strong. Every funeral was different. Every culture had its own way of handling death, but certain patterns emerged. Humans personalized death. Every funeral reflected the individual who had died. A musician might have music, a gardener might have flowers, a soldier might have military honors, a child might have toys. Each life was treated as unique and irreplaceable, regardless of accomplishments or status. Humans transformed grief into art. They wrote poems and songs. They carved beautiful coffins. They created memorial gardens. They painted portraits. They weaponized beauty against the ugliness of death, insisting that love could create something lasting even when the body failed. Humans connected through loss. The Commission documented what they began calling communal grief networks. When someone died, the community activated automatically. People brought food without being asked. They cleaned houses, watched children, made phone calls, sent messages. No one was expected to grieve alone. Isolation during mourning was treated as a tragedy to be prevented. Most remarkably, humans grieved for strangers. Observed memorials for disaster victims the mourners had never met. Candlelight vigils for children who died on other continents. Monuments to unknown soldiers. Moments of silence for victims of violence or accidents or diseases. Humanity had evolved the capacity to mourn abstractly, to feel loss for the concept of life itself. After 3 months and 247 observed funerals, the Commission gathered to compile their findings. They sat in their ship's conference room, surrounded by data screens and holographic displays, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. The emotional sophistication is unlike anything in our records, Calzeth reported. Humans don't just process death. They engage with it actively, almost aggressively. They refuse to accept that death is simply the end of biological function. The ritualization serves multiple purposes, added researcher K, a specialist in social structures. It provides structure during chaos. It creates meaning where meaning might otherwise collapse. It bonds communities together. It processes trauma collectively rather than individually. But the irrationality, interjected researcher, a purely logical species. The beliefs in afterlife, in souls, in continued consciousness without physical form, these are scientifically unfounded, yet humans cling to them desperately. Had been quiet throughout the discussion. Now he spoke. Perhaps, he said slowly, the irrationality is the point. The other researchers turned to him. Consider, continued, every other species we have studied accepts death as logical fact. Consciousness ends, the body ceases. This is reality. We process it and move forward. But humans refuse. They insist, despite all evidence, that there must be more. They create elaborate systems of belief that have no empirical basis. And in doing so, they create actual measurable meaning. He pulled up data on the screens around them. Graphs showing emotional resonance patterns, studies on communal bonding, psychological research on grief processing. Humans who participate in funeral rituals heal faster from loss. Communities with strong funeral traditions show lower rates of prolonged grief disorder. The act of creating meaning, even meaning based on unprovable beliefs, has tangible positive effects. The irrationality serves a purpose. But sir, Calzeth said, if we report this to the Galactic Accord, we are essentially saying that humans have mastered something no other species has. That seems improbable. Was silent for a long moment. Then he made his decision. I believe that is exactly what we must report. In 3,000 years, the Cosmic Mourning Commission has documented 847 species. We have seen every variation of death ritual imaginable, but we have never seen anything like this. Humans have not just created effective death rituals. They have transformed death itself into an opportunity for meaning-making, for connection, for beauty. They grieve as though the universe itself should weep with them. And in doing so, they create the very meaning they insist must exist. He looked at each member of his team. We will recommend to the Galactic Accord that human funeral practices be declared the most emotionally sophisticated death rituals in known space. Furthermore, I will propose that human funeral directors and grief counselors be offered positions throughout the Accord. Every species could benefit from what humanity has learned about loss. The team sat in stunned silence. "That is unprecedented, sir," Kay finally said. "Yes," agreed, "it is." 3 weeks later, Commissioner stood before the full Galactic Accord Assembly. The vast chamber held representatives from every member species. Thousands of beings, taking thousands of forms, all waiting to hear the Commission's findings on humanity. His presentation lasted 2 hours. He showed footage from dozens of funerals. He presented data on emotional resonance, communal bonding, and psychological healing. He explained the patterns the Commission had identified. He made his case carefully, methodically, knowing how extraordinary his claims would seem. When he finished, the chamber was silent. Then Ambassador Hen of the collective stood. Though we're an ancient species, logical and precise, respected throughout the galaxy. "Commissioner," Hen said, her voice echoing through the chamber, "you are asking us to believe that these young, emotional, often violent humans have mastered something that species with 10 times their and 100 times their civilization's age have not. That seems unlikely." Had expected this challenge. "Ambassador, I understand your skepticism. I shared it when we began our study. But I ask you to consider this. Perhaps we have been approaching death wrong. Every species in this chamber processes death logically because we believe logic is the highest form of thought. But humans process death emotionally, irrationally, even illogically, and they heal better for it. They connect deeper. They find meaning where we find only fact." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I watched a 16-year-old human boy read a poem at his grandmother's funeral. The poem claimed that her death should make the stars go dark. This is absurd. The stars do not care about one human's death. The universe is indifferent. But that boy, and everyone listening to him, found comfort in the absurdity. They found meaning in the impossible claim that one life mattered on a cosmic scale." Looked directly at Ambassador Hen. "We have spent trying to make death logical. Humans have spent insisting it is anything but, and they may be right." The debate lasted 3 days. Representatives argued, questioned, demanded more proof. But in the end, the data was undeniable. Human funeral practices produced measurably better outcomes for grief processing, community bonding, and long-term psychological health than any other documented death rituals. The vote was called. The proposal passed unanimously. Human funeral practices were declared the most emotionally sophisticated death rituals in known space. Human grief counselors and funeral directors were invited to establish practices on worlds throughout the Galactic Accord. Universities began offering courses in human death studies. Species that had processed death the same way for thousands of years began reconsidering their approaches. The decision changed the galaxy in ways no one had anticipated. 6 months after the vote received a message from his father was dying, requested leave and traveled to immediately. His father had lived a long life by standards, nearly 800 years. He had been a mathematician, a researcher, a contributor to society. Now his body was failing and there was nothing to be done. When died, the family gathered according to tradition. The body was prepared for crystal preservation. Everything was done properly, logically, as it had been done for 50,000 years. But's youngest sister made an unusual request. "I have been reading about human death rituals," she said quietly. "I would like us to try something different, something that honors father not just as a, but as an individual. The family was uncertain, but they agreed. Contacted a human funeral director named who had recently established a consultation practice on. Arrived the next day, a small human woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. "Tell me about your father," said simply. At first, the family did not understand the question, but waited patiently, and eventually they began to speak. They told stories about his love of mathematical puzzles, about his terrible singing voice that he insisted on sharing anyway, about how he would work through the night when he was excited about a problem, about his kindness to his students, about the way he would hum while he cooked, about his pride in his children, about his love for his deceased wife, gone now for 2 centuries. Listened to everything, then she helped them plan a ceremony. At's funeral, the traditional crystal preservation still took place, but before it did, the family gathered in a way they never had before. They stood together, and one by one, they spoke about who had been. Not just what he had accomplished, but who he was as a person. Told about the time his father had stayed up for 3 days straight helping him solve a research problem, refusing to rest until they found the answer together. Spoke about how their father had supported her decision to become an artist instead of a scientist, even though it was unusual for. His brother told a funny story about their father attempting to learn human cooking and nearly burning down the family kitchen. Then taught them a human song. It was called Amazing Grace, and it was even older than the song had heard at O's funeral. They did not have strong singing voices, and the melody was strange to their hearing. But they sang anyway, their voices blending together in imperfect harmony, speaking of grace and love and salvation. When they finished, realized he was weeping, not with 6 sensory organs this time, but with all 9. His entire body was releasing grief, openly and unashamedly, and his family was doing the same. For the first time in history, they were not processing death logically. They were feeling it completely. Stayed for the reception afterward, teaching the family the human custom of sharing food and stories. She showed them how to laugh and cry in the same breath, how to celebrate life while mourning its end, how to find comfort in community rather than isolation. As she was leaving, stopped her. "Thank you," he said simply. Smiled. "Your father was clearly a remarkable person. I'm honored to have been part of saying goodbye to him." "You have given my family something we did not know we needed," said. "You have shown us how to grieve not just as, but as beings who loved and were loved." His eyes grew moist and realized she was crying. For him, for his father, for a family and a species she barely knew. "That's what we do," she said softly. "We help people say goodbye, and we make sure no one has to do it alone." After she left, stood in his family home, surrounded by memories of his father, and thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. He had set out to document human death rituals as a matter of scientific record. He had ended up discovering something that changed not just his understanding of death, but his understanding of life itself. Humans, he realized, had mastered something profound. They had learned to transform the worst thing that could happen, the end of consciousness, into an opportunity for connection, meaning, and love. They had weaponized beauty against oblivion. They had insisted that individual existence mattered on a cosmic scale, and in doing so, they had made it true. The Cosmic Mourning Commission's declaration spread through the galaxy rapidly. Within a year, human grief counselors were working on 30 different worlds. Within 5 years, that number had grown to 200. Human funeral practices were adapted and modified to fit different species' needs, but the core principles remained: personalization, community, transformation of grief into beauty, and the insistence that every life mattered. Not every species adopted these practices. Some remained committed to their traditional ways, and that was respected. But those who did adopt them reported remarkable results: lower rates of prolonged grief, stronger community bonds, greater sense of meaning and purpose even in the face of loss. The collective, that logical and ancient species, began incorporating storytelling into their death rituals. The who had floated their dead into space in silence started singing songs as they did so. The who had burned bodies instantly began taking time to gather and remember before the flash occurred. Humanity's gift to the galaxy was not their technology, though it was impressive. It was not their science, though they contributed greatly to it. It was not even their art or literature or music, though all were valuable. Humanity's gift was showing the universe how to cry together, how to remember together, how to insist together that love mattered more than logic, that meaning could be created even where none existed before, that death did not have to be the end of connection or significance or beauty. In a galaxy that had processed death logically for millions of years, humanity taught everyone how to grieve illogically, irrationally, impossibly, and powerfully. They taught the universe that sometimes the most sophisticated response to loss was not acceptance but defiance, not logic but love, not silence but song. Commissioner lived another 400 years after his father's death. He continued his work with the Cosmic Mourning Commission, but now with a different perspective. He no longer simply documented death rituals. He helped species learn from each other, share their wisdom, and grow in their understanding of loss and love. When he finally died, his funeral was attended by beings from across the galaxy. There were humans and dozens of other species. They sang songs in many languages. They told stories about his life, his work, his kindness, his curiosity. They cried together and laughed together and remembered together. Now very old by human standards, traveled too for the funeral. She stood at the podium and spoke about the first time she met, how nervous she had been, how honored she was to help his family grieve. She spoke about how his work had changed the galaxy, how he had opened minds and hearts across countless worlds. Understood something important, said, her voice strong despite her age. He understood that how we say goodbye matters, that how we remember matters, that every life, no matter how long or short, no matter from which world or which species, deserves to be honored with tears and laughter and stories and love. She paused, looked out at the gathered mourners, and smiled through her tears. He taught the galaxy how to grieve like humans, and in doing so, he made all of us a little more human ourselves. The funeral ended with a song. Not a song or a human song, but something new, created collaboratively by musicians from 6 different species. It was called the Cosmic Mourning, and it had become something of an anthem in the years since the Commission's declaration. The lyrics, translated into hundreds of languages, spoke of loss and love, of grief and grace, of the impossible beauty of existence and the profound pain of its ending. They spoke of refusing to let death be meaningless, of insisting that every life mattered, of creating light in the face of darkness. As the song swelled through the gathered crowd, as beings of every shape and form raised their voices together, thought about Oz, that ordinary woman whose funeral had started everything. She thought about how one simple ceremony in a small Irish town had somehow changed an entire galaxy's understanding of death. She thought about the boy reading funeral blues at his grandmother's grave, about the jazz funeral dancing through New Orleans streets, about the Aboriginal smoking ceremony and the Mexican altars and the Jewish prayers and the Japanese cremation. She thought about all the ways humans had learned to say goodbye, all the beauty they had created in the face of loss. And she realized that this was humanity's true legacy to the stars. Not conquest or technology or wealth, but this. The knowledge that love could transcend death, that community could ease grief, that beauty could be weaponized against oblivion, that every single life, no matter how brief, deserved to be remembered with tears and laughter and stories and songs. The Cosmic Mourning Commission had declared human funerals the most moving ceremonies ever. But what they had really declared was something deeper, that humanity had learned how to make death itself an act of love, and had taught the galaxy to do the same. In the end, that was what mattered. Not that humans were special, but that they had shown everyone else how to be special too. How to grieve deeply, love fiercely, and insist that meaning existed even when the universe seemed to suggest otherwise. The song ended. The mourners stood together in silence, beings from across the galaxy united in their shared grief for one researcher who had changed everything. Then, following human tradition, they went together to share food and stories, to laugh and cry, to remember and celebrate, to do what humans had taught them all to do: transform loss into connection, death into life, grief into grace. And somewhere in the vast indifference of space, the stars kept shining, as they always had and always would, caring nothing for the beings below. But now, on worlds across the galaxy, those beings had learned not to mind the stars' indifference. They had learned to create their own meaning, their own light, their own insistence that love mattered more than the cold logic of entropy and decay. Humanity had given the galaxy many gifts, but the greatest one was this: they had shown everyone how to say goodbye in a way that honored life, celebrated love, and refused to let death have the final word.